Yeah, we'll just look at that.
We're ready to go.
Okay,
I'm gonna mask up.
I'll give Dean a second.
We're good.
Perfect. All right, I'll go ahead and call the meeting to
Recording in
order.
progress.
And we'll just start off quick with a roll call. McKee here, Schultz.
Here.
Bottoма.
Present.
Varenkamp.
I am here. Thank
And
you.
Nichols is not. All right, we'll just go right into it for the water supply planning, and I'm assuming Kevin's gonna.
Yeah, I can just introduce the design team. Ash Hammerbeck, Steve Hegland, Kent Torvey, and then Ryan Capel is joining us virtual. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having us. If you click on to the next slide, this is work session number 3 for the water supply treatment and storage project. So it's the well, the tower, and the water treatment plant. Tonight we're going to go through a status update. We're going to get into some of the design decisions that we've outlined within this presentation that was in your packet. We really want to know what questions you have. A lot of those questions are going to be around cost, which, if there's anything we can tease out here to help inform what cost evaluations we want to advance, that's kind of our objective for tonight. And then obviously, as we're making these decisions, there's going to be, impacts to the overall budget. And so defining the overall scope and options and what we're considering and how we'll move these things forward. And then Kevin's going to say a little bit about the impacts of user rates and area rates on the overall budget. And we'll do a little project look ahead and schedule an update as well. We can jump into next slide. Status update. Since our last meeting, we've been working on getting the soil borings lined up for the water tower site, for the proposed site over by the church. And so those right of entries are secured for that, as well as for the trunk main that runs to the south and east of the water treatment plant site. Braun is going to be mobilizing to do those in the next 2 weeks. In the meantime, we are waiting on the geotechnical report that includes the water treatment plant site evaluation. We've done a lot in the last week. I was going through this and I said, no, there's lots of updates to these slides. But we provided info on the water treatment plant design in terms of base slab elevations, loadings, and things like that. So we'll apply those to the report. One of the key things relative to the geotechnical report at the water treatment plant site is the groundwater elevation. We have some preliminary data with water logs that shows there's a lot of clays in that area, and so we think some of the water we may have encountered in the borings was very kind of sporadic, but some of it may just be due to perched water within those clay layers. In some areas it's high, some areas it's low, and I think our most consistent data point is what we did for the test well on that site, which shows that it's even lower yet than some of those items. But that becomes relevant when we start designing the vertical elevation and the depth of the tanks. How low can we go and build up from there?
Can I ask a question about that?
Yep.
Are you going to go into detail about the clay and the Corcoran's geology, or can I ask a question about that?
I'm not going to go into any detail on that.
Oh, okay.
I'd wait until Braun issues their report on that, because what we have is just the boring logs.
Oh, okay.
That
Because
show the types of plays and.
yeah, because there's one little tiny area of sand in Corcoran, and the rest is clay. So it's not as if we're going to not run into that unless we go into the strip of sand isn't that far from the site, but it's not as if we're going to just choose the water tower site on the one area of Corcoran with sand.
Yeah, no, and that's less of an impact. I mean, we just want to know where the groundwater is, because MDH cares about that relative to.
Sure, okay.
Storage of groundwater, there's got to be some separation for that, but it's not, it's nothing that would be unexpected. It's just, comes into play when the contractor wants to understand, what type of soils there are and if we need to do any corrections. So we'll get into that more once we get the report back from Ron. So.
All right.
Yep, and then we've done some engagement with the Public Works group. We had a design meeting with them on January 6th, and then we did 2 water treatment plant tours on January 13th. We saw the Chaska facility, and that was targeted. These are both plants that Stantec has designed. And Chaska has liquid chlorine, hypochlorate, which is like kind of a key design decision, and then Grove Heights has gas chlorine. So a lot of really good conversation. I think it was a really valuable and good use of time. And we're going to be following up with another meeting with Public Works on February 10th. And then also attached to this proposal, or this presentation, we have some preliminary building footprint and concept layouts complete, as well as a site concept and preliminary grading plan, both of which have been shared with the planning department and are going to also be presented to the public safety committee next week, just to get preliminary comment and thoughts about that. So, status update, and then we can jump into our 4 design decisions. And again, our goals for tonight, you know, I assume you guys kind of read through these, you might have some questions. We want to collect all of those questions, follow up on any items that you specifically want answers to, and then look ahead to March 10th is what we're going to shoot for the next meeting date. And at that time, we want to, you know, address your questions. At that meeting, we want to provide some budget updates. So what costs are we comparing? You know, are there any items we can roll out to define the scope further? And then, you know, get those decisions so that we can carry those into final design. Incorporate them into preliminary and then carry them. So that's kind of our goal for tonight. So the 4 decisions off the top are looking at capacity. The second one is aeration tower. The third one is disinfection chemical. And then the last one is related to the tower capacity. So and you can start with any initial questions if you've read through this. Otherwise, I can kind of summarize through this slide and keep going through this.
We're fine.
So yeah, the initial construction and capacity that we're talking about is serving the box in all these shapes. So the box is the northeast area of the Northeast Noosa. The original, you know, estimated max day capacity, 1.44 MGD. And then the future build-out, which is really the max build-out of the Northeast Noosa, has an estimated max day demand of 6 MGD. And so those are the 2 values that we would, you know, design between 1.44 and 6. And really our consideration is how do we phase these expansions? Do we have 1, 2, or 3 phases? You know, what are those interim steps? And, you know, what do you feel, what do you see as kind of the growth projection? Because it might influence you to build a little bit more now and look ahead to, you know, kind of a longer runway versus, you know, incrementally stepping through this and being more conservative on the capacity side. So, but with all of our options, you know, our key goals are to be flexible and expandable, and so our layouts reflect that opportunity and goal. Let's get to the next slide. So that's just a map of kind of what we're talking about in terms of our northeast system, the initial areas, the future build out, and then we include that bottom, I'm calling it the shoe, that would be included in the northeast pressure zone. So that's also something that would be served by this treatment facility. Let's go to the next one. So this is the slide I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. What it does is it compares the size of the filters. So, you know, our options range from 16 by 16 to 20 by 20. And really what we want to do is when we're talking about max capacity, future build out, expandability, we don't want to have too many small cells at the max capacity. So we're, you know, skipping down to the end and saying, all right, if we're going to target 6 MGD at the max, how many cells would we need? And if we went 20 by 20. And that's kind of our decision making of like, okay, how do we want to size these? What's going to be the best option? So when you reach future build out, you don't have, extra valves, extra piping, extra components that you don't really need. And so I think through our discussions, we've kind of settled and, provide a recommendation of the 20 by 20 route. And so that's why those items are highlighted there. And really, again, base case number 1 is to build 2 filter cells, 20 by 20. One of them is operational. Or you can just put in the guts of the second cell as well and operate 2 cells at 20 by 20, and that really gives you a capacity of 2.3 MGD. So if you remember that range of 1.4 to 6. And then the third alternate, or I guess second alternate on top of base and alt 1 would be to build the footprint for 3 cells, put the guts, and what I mean by that is all the piping and functional components of the cells in 2, and leave the third one for future where you can just install and begin operating the third cell. And so that would give you a runway further out towards, 3 to 3.5 MGD.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
And I should have called and asked for this in advance, but the MGD is a good measure, but what's the relevant population of the town rather than, is it just multiplicative where we just take, if today the demand is 2 and we're at 7,000, then when we're at 14,000, the demand is 4, or is it linear, or is it logarithmic, or what is the?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty linear. Some of the, growth patterns, like if you would, it's all based on land use, right, and how we put the demand to the land use and whatnot, so some areas could grow faster, but generally when you do like the population equivalents, it's pretty linear from, 6 working backwards, so, think about the MUSA, the Northeast MUSA being developed halfway.
So we're only thinking about if our town is 7,000 and the northeast MUSA is, let's just pretend that the MUSA area is 3,000 of our 7,000. The northeast is 1,500, and at 1,500 we need 2. Is that accurate?
Didn't quite follow that, but if it's a linear,
We're just trying to figure out how many people are in the MUSA area today.
sure.
And then we're assuming that half of the population is north of the MUSA and half is south of the MUSA. That's not accurate today, but let's pretend it is. So then, since this well is servicing mostly the upper half and is backup for the bottom half, then if we were to take and say the use today is going to be 2, then we need the population to be 15,000 to reach 6. Or is that, do the math so we're trying to make a decision on capacity, but
Right.
MGD is not relevant.
Yeah, and actually in the spreadsheet, I have another column that has that. I just didn't put the as relevant 2%, so I do have that. I just don't know off the top of my head. In terms of buildable acres, the box, that northeast area.
Yeah.
Is 745 developable acres.
Okay,
And then the whole northeast MUSA is 1,984. So it's roughly, 2.5, almost 3 times.
so 1,984. So it's like,
So
what,
it's almost
4
like
square
the
miles?
northeast area is about, 1/3 of the total.
Yeah,
And we're talking about the average day demand in just the box. That's 1.8 MGD.
today. Or 1,
Max build out, for max build out.
So all of these assumptions assume that that box is fully built out.
Full.
All of the industrial is there, all of that
Okay.
residential there.
Okay.
Not to serve what's there today, it's to serve what's gonna be there in the future. So one of the other pieces, when we look at these numbers, these are assuming we're following that land use plan. A lot of the challenges we have is the industrial isn't there. We can have ranges that are warehouse where they have a couple bathrooms, which is little to no water. You
Yeah.
We could get a very heavy industrial user that wants to come into the processing center that needs lots of water. And so we've kind of been trying to build these projections on the higher end to give us some flexibility. One of the challenges building it so early here is we don't have that history to go off of. So we're really trying to project, using that land use as that guide.
Yeah, so the challenge for you is the same as ours, where we have to figure out what's our population gonna be in 2040, what's the use gonna be in 2040?
And if we go back to that land use map on top of it, a lot of on that County Road 30 corridor, we see a lot of mixed use, and there we have so much flexibility. You could
Yeah.
have low density, or you could have a very high.
Yeah,
density.
yeah,
There's really a whole lot of variability there, and we don't know until they come into the line.
yes,
So one of the things Ash is trying to highlight here is going to the bigger cell now, we kind of want to look at that first step and that last step. And we don't want to take too big of a bite off of that first step, but once we get to the end, we don't, from an operational standpoint, having that 6, 7, 8, 9 cells long-term is really a lot of work. It's so much more on the back end, so we really want to make a big enough bite now that it also pays.
sure, yeah.
Once-
So we gotta strike a balance between, I don't know, 2,000 people paying for extra capacity today, or 7,000 people paying for,
And Kevin
extra-
talked about it, but also one of the things with this is it's also paid through area fees, and so it's not just the users today, it's as development happens, they're paying.
Yeah, but-
Fee that covers.
then the city takes the risk of it not being, tons of cities got in trouble in 2000, in 2009, back when I was a kid, in 1992, like all these, the risks that the city could take a lot of risk if we said build it out as if we're gonna develop that whole thing, or we could minimize the risk. We just gotta, I think it's relevant to say, how many people does this matter? There's assumptions we gotta figure out, and we're not gonna be perfect. We just gotta do a risk versus reward balance and assessment on how
Very much
big we
so.
make this
That's why I
thing.
tried the box was maybe a starting point to try
I
to
think-
show you really what, and we know that it doesn't develop in that clean manner, right? We don't get the nice corner
Yeah.
that comes in first, and then
Yeah.
everything else fills in so linearly, but at least to give an idea of what that is.
Yeah, Yep.
So, yeah, looking at this one, I mean, the max build out, of the box, 1.8 MGD. And then the future build out of the entire one is gonna be 6. So you can kind of think of it a, 1/3, 2/3.
yep. So this is super helpful.
Okay.
We're working together to figure out.
Yeah.
So again, that box was 740 acres, you said?
745 acres, yeah.
So 750 roughly 1.2 square miles.
The other thing to keep in mind, also, but we have a lot of wetlands, as you guys
Yep.
know, incorporate. So we take those out of our calculations just because we don't want to account for all of this wetland and floodplain, because we don't want to account for those areas as well, to try to keep it as accurate as we
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
Mayor and council, just quick from staff, so what we're really trying to do is, there's a short-term decision, right, where we want to optimize, and then there's a long-term decision that we want to optimize, so we're really trying to evaluate both those scenarios and try to see what makes the most sense, if we're just looking, we want to optimize the short-term scenario, if that's the council's goal, optimize the short-term scenario, we might have a different recommendation. If you want us to optimize just solely prioritize the long-term scenario, we might have a different option. It might be larger. We're really trying, that chart is complicated. It took me 2 days to figure it out. So I.
You're from Wisconsin though, right?
And
He's a
Michigan.
Wisconsin fan.
So, I mean,
Lives
it's
in Minnesota,
complicated,
yes.
but really what that is it's really an effort to optimize both the short and the long, and then try to merge that together as best as we can and explain that. So great questions, we can bring back some more detail on that. But really what we're trying to do is optimize both, see what makes the most sense, and then kind of blend that together. So if maybe in the short term, it might be 18 by 18 might be the best size if we just prioritize the short term. Long term, it's looking like definitely 20 by 20 is, so, do we hedge that? How much more is it to buy now with where we're at? Is there gonna be more cost to go from 18 by 18 in concrete and materials than to build up to 20 by 20 now? What is that cost difference? We'll bring that back to you. We think it's advantageous in value to maybe consider that if it's such a superior design in the backside. So just that, in a very high level, we're really evaluating hard on that, and that gets back to that flexibility, expandability challenge we have. And then in the next run, we'll definitely tie that back into the financial planning, that risk management that we did, probably in the first goal session, where we kind of looked at how fast we think development will come, because that's really the key driver. We have to be comfortable in our assumptions of what's coming, just so we understand it. So, and again, these are capital costs. They would get divided out over the buildable areas in Northeast. We should all know that if the development doesn't come in, then any of those bonding payment, that gets transferred to the user. Keep in mind, the users are the users of the systems of the new development. So there is that risk, but hopefully our financial plan, our brackets that we're targeting, we know and can plan a little bit as we get into that. So, and I think where we landed to date, and we need to revise it, was we were pretty comfortable with what it take to get to that, $14.5 million number. I don't think we've seen any less, at least at this point, we haven't seen any reductions in interest in the area. So I think we're still trending in the right way, and we'll bring back those incremental differences between some of these and be able to, kind of calculate, like, is this worth it or not? And even at the last meeting, we're like, let's keep just evaluating where we think we said and what the next step is, and if there's a value added, let's maybe consider it. So all we're trying to do is consider those value added components, because the information changes monthly in Corcoran. So we're still at a point where we're doing that, but coming up in the next couple of months, we're gonna have to be more committed to one approach, just because we have to progress the design. So apologize for that long-winded.
No, that's great.
Did great.
It's really important.
And one thing to consider, another tool to help you kind of step into this instead of, diving off the deep end, and committing to something, is using bid alternatives. And so, like I was saying, a base case, alternate 1, alternate 2, those can be, we could design a 3 filter cell facility, but we could bid out alternates that size it back down to, base case, alternate 1, alternate 2, get the bids in, because that's another component that, is of everybody's concern, is the volatility in pricing and where bids come in. So you don't want to, put all your eggs in the basket and say, yeah, we're going to design this, 3 cell filter and go for it, and have prices be way out of line with, what we could reasonably predict because of pricing. So.
Can you explain the difference in the cell count for the same size cell, same MGD, same
Yeah.
gallons per
Can you
minute?
scroll down to that slide, please?
Like here,
Good.
20,
More
24,
directly, so-
5,
Yeah,
up here too.
that is a good question.
Is there a line that you're?
Well, it's in several cases, but the bottom 2 lines are ones that stand out, and then you can see it in the 3rd and 4th ones,
Yeah.
right above it.
Yeah, so it kind of
Second,
comes down
third.
to like what our target loading rate on the cell is. And so we want to target 2, so that last column is really what's pertinent. And, if we're trying to target, 4,200 GPM applied over 4 20x20 cells, that's a loading rate 2.63, that's not where we want to be. But if
Oh,
we
so
add
you're
that cell-
you're overloading the cells then, basically.
Correct, yep,
Okay,
yep.
I see. So it's more efficient at a lower number.
Right, yep, we want to stay at 2 or below. You
Okay.
can push that a little higher, but that's our design number.
Okay, and 20 by 20 is recommended, why?
So when we get down to the final,
Yep,
if we're looking at 20 by 20s, we would need 5 cells total.
right, versus 6 of 18 by 18s.
Correct, and then I think the number is 8 if you go 16 by 16, so
Mhm.
that's a lot of cells. And that's why we want to try to minimize the number of cells at max while striking the balance of not oversizing them at the initial phases. And so we think that 20 by 20 strikes that balance where, again, your operators are gonna really appreciate not having,
So it has to do with complexity of the system and how the operation goes versus cost of the number of cells and square foot.
I think there is an incremental but small there's a marginal cost to upsizing the cells on day one
Uh-huh,
and committing to that for the long term versus, you know, saving pennies more so
yep.
with sizing the cells smaller today
Mhm.
than having more at the final build out.
Does it get more complex though in the operation wise?
Not necessarily. I mean, the complexity would come from additional valves and automation.
Okay.
And, you know, automatic valves that, you know, you have issues with or need replacement, things like that. But the process itself is all gravity filtration, and that's kind of the beauty of gravity.
Yep, okay.
Comes in handy sometimes.
Ash, can I add a comment?
Yeah, that's Ryan. The voice of God is.
I was gonna say.
Hello, everybody. I would use an analogy to a ratchet with the size and the quantity of cells. With each click of the ratchet, would represent an additional cell. As you ratchet up another level and add a third, a fourth, and a fifth cell, you're adding 5 filter function valves with each of those cells. And so with that, you're adding wash troughs, you're adding more filter under drain. So you're adding more incremental costs with each click of the ratchet. So the goal would be to keep the total number of clicks within reason. And we believe that the 20 by 20 splits the difference nicely in that we could range from 16 foot by 16 foot cells up to 24 by 24 in the case of one of the largest cell that we've ever constructed. So the 20 foot by 20 foot really does split the difference and puts us in a good place. Generally we would want to have at least 2 cells, if not 3, and we believe that the likelihood of you needing at least 3 cells with the growth anticipated is very high. And so a 20 by 20 with 3 cells right there in the middle of the page puts us in a nice medium location, or a nice kind of comfortable zone to be in. Regardless of how the growth goes, we think it's likely you'll at least hit that 3-cell sweet spot. So I just wanted to point that out.
Does this process work where these cells work independently, or do they work together as like a series? I guess what I'm asking about is,
Filter is independent.
so if you have an issue with one, you still have operational?
Yeah,
It's
the
not like-
second one, right.
Okay,
Yep. Yeah, it's not like a series. It's all, you know, individual.
right, so if one goes down for some
One
reason,
cell.
you can still operate maybe at just a little lower capacity? Okay,
Yeah, and that happens too, like when you're backwashing a filter, you can still produce water. In some cases, you have other. So,
Right. And that's exactly why we'd like to get up to at least 3 cells at some point, so that if you can take one down and you still have 2 to operate. So admittedly, if the phase 1 of this project is to build 2 20 by 20 cells, that isn't exactly where we want to be for the long term, because if you take one cell down, you're left with your flow going to the other cell, and that's going to overwhelm it. But we believe, based on the growth projections, that the likelihood of that getting to the point where you need 3 cells, or at least 3 MGD in the population that serves, is high. And so we want to build the plant. If we decide on that cell size, we can't go back. We can't make them smaller, and we can't make them 1 cell, a certain square footage, and then add on smaller cells. Things need to remain symmetric for the pumps that are supplying water to the filters during washing and so on. We need to keep things in a symmetric growth. So this is where we've really arrived on that 20 by 20.
so the 20 by 20, you're talking 400 square feet incremental change. That's the total of the cell, or is that just the unit? So is there additional square footage that's needed if you add a cell? I mean, to me, additional 400 square feet on a building doesn't seem like very much to build out.
Yeah, the back end has the layouts, and so really the entire building would extend another you know, 25 feet, when you're considering the walls and whatnot.
Right.
So that dimension increases across the board, and some of that has to do with, you know, again, your final capacity is gonna be 3 MGD, you're gonna want more storage for chemicals, because you're gonna need more eventually, and it would just be more cost efficient to build the building footprint and envelope all at once.
Yeah, so we're talking bigger than 400 square feet per unit.
Correct.
So the screen here, this would be the facility layout, where you would see there's your 2 filter
Right.
areas. And so they, as we build it out, we just continue to expand beyond.
And then if we're on the lower level too, there's also clear well, which where you're pumping from, and that gets bigger. And then the backwash volume you would need gets bigger too. So it's not just, oh, we're having extra storage rooms upstairs that we don't need. It's that tank volume on the lower level is why you need to expand the footprint.
So do these tanks, the clear well and the backwash tank, is that that whole unit in there? Is that like a sealed unit?
Can you scroll to the next sheet, please?
Yes.
You know what I mean? I'm trying to guess, are you not rebuilding this whole tank when you expand, or what are you doing with it?
If you added on a third cell at a later date, you
Yeah.
would, just add it on and tack it on. Is that?
Yeah, I mean,
You
that,
wouldn't reconstruct it, no, you just add on.
you add an additional, so, I mean, is it a tank inside of this area? Is that what we're talking about, or are we talking about the walls of this, is actually the walls of the tank?
The walls of that are the walls of the tank,
Yeah. Think of this view that you're looking at as a Olympic swimming pool, and these are lanes. As we extend this plant and add a symmetric 20 by 20 cell to the north as it is, which is to the left on the page, we add that square out there. We would also, in the lane on the top where the clear well is, we'd add a symmetric amount of clear well volume to serve that filter. So the filter has a tank to flow into. Likewise, on the bottom of the page, the backwash tank would have to expand where Ash is gesturing to allow volume for the new filter to wash into. And so by laying the plan out, this is strategic to lay it out in these lanes so that with each incremental click of the ratchet and expansion, that we get the associated volume we need for finished water to be stored and for wash water to be stored.
It's just,
On top of that, when we go up one level to the main level, we need to deliver water from the wells to these filters, and so we're also creating a lane of traffic or a lane in the pool to allow water from the detention tank on the right-hand side of the page to flow to the left on the page into the future cells. So a lot of thought has gone into the configuration here to allow that incremental expansion to have minimal cost and disruption to the overall plant. That said, each time we touch the building, each time we mobilize a contractor and procure a project, we have to tear off some kind of finishes, we have to go backwards at least a partial step to build onto the plant. And so by avoiding those increments, we really gain some cost savings, and that's where the alternates that Ash is talking about, it may behoove you to build some of this skeleton now, even if we don't put all of the filter internals and the cost of the pieces inside the media and the troughs and such. We can build it now so that at least we don't have to disrupt the building when the time comes when the demand is there to justify that additional filter capacity.
so you could build out the building to accommodate 3 cells, but not have the third filter in place.
Right.
That way you wouldn't disrupt
Correct.
the backwash tank or clear well tank.
right?
To me, that makes more
Correct.
sense than dismantling those tanks and building them bigger at the time.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's exactly the advantage, is that you're gonna have an incremental cost savings associated with building the footprint of 3 cells, which is, you know, you're only gonna operate 2 to start. And then in the future, you don't have to, you know, rip off parts of the building to add on. All you have to do is procure some equipment, put those internals into the filter, and you're off to the races, so.
I imagine there's a downtime component too, if you've got those, both that backwash tank and clear well tank down.
Yeah, you'd have to.
Yeah, if you had to redo
there would
the whole
be
thing.
Some considerations for construction, for sure.
And you would, if you had that third tank just skeletoned out, or the third cell skeletoned out, if there was a user that was attractive to the city that required a lot of water, I mean, you would be able to just update that portion,
Yeah.
bring
Yeah.
that cell on at that exact time, so you could time that a lot more efficiently.
Right.
So just, it's, again, meeting the idea, you know, again, pricing will be the biggest variable, but that's where we feel like that is an advantage, so we're kind of, you know, pushing that to make sure that, you know,
Yeah.
it's not wise to include, and the ultimate cost is probably gonna be the end game, right, when we actually get a bid, so we gotta build that
Because
flexibility.
I'm assuming these tanks now, if you're at 2 filter capacity, running 2 filters, and they're built out to 3, they just have lower volume in them, sitting in them, right?
It's gonna be proportional volume.
Well, I mean, you just wouldn't have, it'd be proportional to what it would be if the tank was, if those tanks were built for 2 filters currently. You wouldn't fill them up to capacity to run 3 tanks, because they're 3 filters. You know what I'm saying? It would work.
No, you would need additional volume in both the backwash and the clear well to accommodate a third cell.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you build those tanks for 3 cell capacity now,
Yep.
you just don't run those tanks at 3 cell capacity when you're only running 2 filters, right? You run them at 2 cell capacity or whatever. that
Well,
is.
yeah, you have extra storage though, and
Right.
that gives you a lot of operational
Right.
flexibility. So there is an operational benefit.
There's no
to
there's no
having-
detriment to having larger tanks with fewer
Yes,
cells.
Yep, yeah, yep. Correct.
Correct. We're just pushing the filters less hard if we have more square feet to share the water into.
Yep.
Okay.
And so the filter runs, the time where the filter operates before it becomes plugged is extended if we don't have to put as much water through. If I said that clearly, I guess if we decrease the loading rate, we're going to just have longer filter runs until we need to backwash. And so the filters will appreciate that, and we'll have that built-in flexibility. And as the demand on the plant and the population grows for filtered water, we'll be able to just put a little more load on the filters until they get up to their
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 GPM per square foot target.
Yeah, yeah, what I'm hearing from this conversation that we need to bring you is maybe a little bit more detail on the population to capacity, so you kind of have that feel.
Yep.
And then the cost is gonna be a big driver of this decision, and where that comes in, so I don't wanna rush off this topic, because it's a lot of really good.
Yeah,
info,
I don't mean to derail it, but when
No,
you're
it's a
talking,
good
when you
conversation.
talk about cost, I'd like to know cost to build out to 3 now
Yeah,
versus building out to 2 and having to renovate.
yeah.
The-
Yeah, that's exactly what we're gonna do, base case, alt 1, alt 2, or put those into a cost comparison, so you have an idea of where those levels are at,
Right.
and then you can weigh that against where you really think your demand is gonna fall, to make, you know, how far is your runway, how far does that investment get you?
Yeah.
Perfect.
That's the balance we wanna strike, so.
Sounds good.
It's very
Can-
complicated, right? A lot of
There's-
uncertainties.
John, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna ask about, you know, there is population that's important, and we shouldn't assume that everyone connected to this system is just a house, even though it seems like it around
Yeah,
here.
I'm seeing like a growing population.
But there have been people that have inquired about campuses, like, office campuses in that area, so we don't wanna make capacity so, so small that that we are unable to attract
Yeah,
campuses.
Right,
Mhm.
Good
Not to
point.
say, we just wanna have that on the table.
for sure.
Yeah, and if you had the third cell just waiting there, you'd have a really good idea of what exactly that price would be to add the internals and start it up.
Sure.
You know that price, that's when you could communicate with
Makes sense.
such an industry,
Perfect.
so.
Sounds good. Just wanted
So
to-
Just one more question.
Oh, sure, sorry.
Again,
Yep,
that graph shows 5th and 6th well, 5 cells, 1 treatment plant. That site will take care of all of this. That's my biggest question.
The wells won't all be on that site.
Nope, I understand that,
Just
just
all
the
the-
treatment plant
Heat to-
would be able to handle
whole
the box,
piece
the
of-
shoe, all the other things you've got in that picture. Got it,
Yep.
thank you.
Yep, all the
Thanks.
shapes.
Perfect.
I like the analogies, if that's the way we wanna say it. Good job.
All right, so
Well, in fact, we believe the site could accommodate more than the 6 MGD, depending on what
Wow,
treatment you need in the future. The way that's being laid out, it could actually accommodate more if that were to be the case.
yeah.
neat.
Yeah, and then we actually, we should touch on other stuff, but we talked about lateral, or going north, right, for our current process. They've laid it out so that if we do bring on in 15 years, 20 years, another treatment process, basically that just flops over just immediately east of the building. So then, you know, you guys can briefly touch on it, but, so if we want to bring on another treatment process, like the chloride,
Membrane cell.
yeah, it's something, so it's laid out to be able to expand well and keep all the
Yeah,
options
we
on the
don't
table. So
want
let's,
to
yeah.
take up valuable real estate that can be used for something like that. We want to maximize the
Great job.
usability of this site, so.
This piece is the most important, isn't it? Of all the things we're gonna talk about tonight?
I would say
up there.
this and disinfection chemical is one I want to get to real quick,
Okay.
because that's pretty important from a safety.
Do you want to skip, is that number 3?
Yeah.
You want
it
to
is.
skip to that, or do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just briefly touch on this. I think we have a good idea of kind of where we want to go, because an aeration tower is going to use air instead of chemical to oxidize the iron. And so by building that treatment plant, or that treatment process up front, it's going to save you a lot of chemical. You're going to be adding less chemical to your water. And so we're looking at that. That would add building height to the overall building, because you got to start your quote-unquote waterfall, your gravity waterfall at a higher elevation, but that's just the trade-off on that item, so. We can, if
We've
there's more questions about it, our next step is gonna be to also start building out the vertical profile, so we'll know how that impacts the
Gotcha.
architecture.
Some of the examples we saw previously had that in it, didn't it? Okay.
Yeah.
Kind of that chimney or elevated part. yeah.
Yep.
Yep, the Stacy Water Treatment Plant is a good example, and that's where,
Gotcha.
you know, you'll see those sitting outside, they can be inside as well. So, all right, yeah, decision number 3 is related to the disinfection chemical, and so this is where we're talking about chlorine gas versus sodium hypochlorite liquid. And the main considerations are safety, treatment effectiveness and consistency, and then cost, both capital, the chemical cost, and then I'll call it the operational cost. And so skipping or going on to chlorine gas, there's some pros and cons related to that. We'll go to the next slide. You know, we're talking about the initial build out. What you can imagine is those gas cylinders that are tall and skinny, and those are 150-pound cylinders. The one that was shown on the previous photo is a 2,000-pound cylinder that's in a submarine chloritainer is what they call it, that contains and is like a safety precaution for that large 2-ton cylinder. So for the initial build out, you could expect to have between 2 and 4 of those 150-pound cylinders. Gas is really precise for metering dosing, consistent, and is the cheapest option, the least expensive option across both the capital expenditure and the, you know, the cost of the chemical and O&M long term. The cons and the things to consider is obviously there's a greater hazard to human health if you have chlorine gas versus liquid chlorine, which would impact risk assessment planning, and like the safety options associated with it are a bit more expensive. So to address those, that's why we're getting public safety's, you know, input. We've sent them a list of the chemicals that we will have stored on site, because they are, you know, largely involved in the risk management planning. The hypochlorite, which is the next slide. This would include a liquid, and there's 2 options, I should say, on this. One is to self-generate, and that's a very capital-intensive proposition. You have a skid that uses salt and electrolysis to produce hypochlorite, so it's a pretty complex system. but it can be cheaper than buying liquid hypochlorite from Hawkins and having it delivered on site. However, you know, from a risk to public health type of situation, like, you know, the worst case scenario, it's like driving a car versus flying in a plane. If something bad happens with chlorine gas, it'd be really bad, but the likelihood of it is probably less versus, you know, day to day, you're driving a car, your risk can be, you know, it's kind of how you want to weigh your risks. So, you know, cons as we're looking forward, larger physical presence, higher cost for equivalent dosing, and sometimes the hypochlorite can vary in strength. However, that may be debated by certain people who use the chemical. So, the next slide is a rough breakdown. I'd like to refine this slide a little bit more for you because we've been talking with our, during our site tours, some of those costs of chemicals have really increased. And so when we're looking on a cost basis, we've seen that it's about a 2-to-1 for gas chlorine versus sodium hypochlorite. And I would say that both of those unit prices have almost doubled. So double those numbers and that's kind of where you would fall for annual O&M, the cost of chlorine. And again, this chlorine is used to oxidize the iron manganese in the water, and then also to disinfect on the safer side. So those are kind of the considerations. One thing to keep in mind is, like, at the beginning, when you are operating 2 cells day one, you would, you know, be dealing with those smaller cylinders. And as you build out closer to 5 cells, that would probably make sense to move to the 2,000-pound cylinders, which comes with a different set of considerations. Another thing is that if you decide something now, you could always change in the future if it made more sense. Or, you know, there's a different risk you wanted to take differently in the future. So
Change between the gas versus the liquid?
yeah, so say you're comfortable with 150-pound cylinders. That's pretty typical for treatment plants of this size.
Yeah.
But, you know, once you expand, you don't want to commit to the 2-ton cylinders. It'd be possible to switch at that point to hypochlorite or hypochlorite generation. So there's some flexibility in that. So again, not that you're committing to something that you're going to have to live with for the entirety, because this is a phased project. And we want to have an idea of the future, but this is a less important future consideration decision. There's more flexibility in that decision for the phase 1 versus the phase 2 or phase 3 scenario.
Well, I understand it's possible, but if the cost of changeover is so great, it might not be feasible. Or are you saying that the cost of changeover in the facility would not be that much?
The cost of changeover in the future would not be as significant because everything would be growing in size. You'd be making kind of wholesale changes to how much chemical you would need when you bump from like a 3-cell to a 5-cell.
Yeah.
So at that point, you'd be making an investment. A lot of that equipment might age out. You want to do updates to that portion of your facility at that point anyway. So
I did have a quick question on the hypochlorite. Mentioned that you could potentially create it on site with additional investment. Like, what kind of
yeah.
investment or what kind of system would you need in place to be able to do that? And is it, what type of savings are you looking at by being able to do it on site?
Yeah, so on-site generation of hypochlorite is still going to be more expensive than chlorine gas.
Okay.
The system that you would have for on-site chlorine generation is, it's a skid and it's electrolysis, and so there's a lot more moving parts to it, more complex parts that would require service if they broke down. And again, this is your disinfection, method. So there could be some more risks in that perspective. Operational learning curve might be higher with that option. But yeah, it involves creating a brine solution with salts, high quality salts, using electrolysis within that skid and then producing a hypochlorite solution. So you can make it more on demand, might not sit as long as, you know, a bulk delivery from Hawkins.
Gotcha, thank
Yeah.
you.
So the price point would be somewhere between gas and sodium hypochlorite?
For on-site generation?
Yeah.
We have to look at it for the scalability, because I think at the phase one, you know, smaller volume, you might see a cost savings on the bulk sodium hypochlorite delivery versus the on-site generation, just because that capital expense of the unit itself for on-site generation will be pretty significant. But again, if cost is a big concern, you know, on kind of that priority of safety, cost, operations, that's something we can break down further.
Yeah, I think you'd have to look at the break point of where it makes sense to generate your own.
For
Yeah.
sure.
You don't need a decision between gas and sodium hypochlorite tonight, do you?
No,
Okay.
again, just looking at what your questions are, you know, you understand that price is gonna be a driver on a lot of these questions, but if there's anything that's non-price related, that's kind of what we also want to get to the heart of.
Is chlorine gas then contained into one of these vessels?
Yeah, so that 2-ton cylinder
Yep.
photo, yeah, that's like a submarine, like it's got a hatch on it, you put the tank in there and that thing is sealed up.
But then it must be piped outside of that facility,
Yeah,
right?
and so it's not, and again, the chlorine gas is not pressurized, like there's not, you know, it's all vacuum, it's sucked out of those containers. So
Oh.
it's not like it's a pressurized thing just ready to go. It needs to be pulled out of those cylinders.
So there's some safety system if it doesn't,
Yes.
if there isn't something actively drawing it, it's not going to leak per se.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are tons of safety features that go along with both options. This chlorine is not something you mess with, liquid or gas. So.
When we originally talked about this, we were talking, there was conversation about hooking into, and being a backup to Maple Grove, them to us, us to them. Is it matter how we treat compared to theirs if we're gonna join into that system?
Not for this decision, no.
Okay,
No.
thanks.
Question?
No, and frankly, staff's still vetting out, and we don't have a recommendation for you tonight yet. We know that, we just wanted to get it in front of you, and if you have follow-up questions, or you're doing your own research, reach out to me, and we can make sure that gets addressed when we bring it back. But, I mean, we've spent a lot of time, it's important to our staff to understand this, because we don't deal with these chemicals, so we want to make sure we're doing everything mindful again, and again, maintain flexibility, so we might start with gas, and then convert on the second expansion of the site or something, we don't know yet, right? So, but we just, you know, it's something that you guys should put a little bit of research in if you have the capacity, and just, we don't know what that is, we're reaching out to our neighbors, our trusted colleagues, getting advice from both sides and trying to formulate a recommendation here when we bring it back to you, so it's not finalized from our end yet either.
All right.
Gotcha.
You got 53 seconds for the last
I
one.
think that's a minute or two fast, so
With
we
a
have
minute or
couple
two
couple
fast, we
minutes.
should probably,
Take a deep breath. All right, so we'll give some more information on those, but again, yeah,
Adjourn?
do some research, ask other questions. We're gonna engage public safety, and so we'll get their input on that. We can report that back to you as well. So decision 4 talks about the tower volume and clear well storage. And this is, again, you know, some considerations relative to cost. What's the marginal increase to increase the tower volume? And then understanding that in Northeast, for future next build out, we want 2 towers, or 2 million gallons of storage, roughly 2.3. So there's gonna be a second tower in Northeast. That's just something I think important to visualize. And then, you know, we're talking about operational flexibility. It's really nice to have a lot of clear well storage at the plant. That can give some flexibility, but, you know, there's also maybe something to be said for symmetry down the line if you want to have 2 1 million gallon towers. You take one down, you still have that 1 million gallon in your back pocket during refilling. So another comment, because we have pulled some preliminary cost estimates for both the 750 and the 1 million gallon, both composite and the Petasphere, which is kind of like the all metal looking one. And the Petasphere is 10-15% more expensive than a composite. That's a composite because of the price of steel. And so that's something to consider as we're looking ahead, and we want to know volume. What if we build a bigger clear well at the treatment plant? There'll be cost implications to that. We'll try to price those options out for you again to make these decisions. And then as we consider type, I know there's concern about the aesthetics and how
By the time we'd be looking at a second tower, that's, barring crazy
yeah.
growth beyond what we expect, we're looking quite a ways out.
For the max, yeah. So you need to have, as much storage as your average day demand.
Mhm.
And so that in the future would be 2.3 MGD, again, future max build out.
Gotcha.
I don't think symmetry is a big concern, really. Are people going to sit there and look at one tower and go, I can tell that's 250,000 gallons smaller than the other one? I guess.
Operational symmetry of.
I guess what I was wondering is when you do look at these alternatives, when you limit your clear well space, I'm assuming there's a cost savings with the building in that regard, or is that space used for something else?
So we wouldn't increase like the building envelope above. It's just
Yeah.
like underneath on that lower level.
Oh, okay.
That wall might take out 10 extra, 15 extra feet.
So it's probably
No
really
worries.
marginal savings of any kind.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, we just did actually today, we got open bids for a 300,000 gallon clear well, and that came in at $2 million. Again, there's costs associated with mobilization and things like that, but that equates to $6.50 a gallon versus when we're looking at a tower that's ranging from like $4 to $4.50 a gallon. So
We are out of time, but I appreciate it. That was a good question to end up on.
thank you.
And we'll probably have another one of these.
We'll have another work session
Coming up.
coming up, I think, in the next month.
Yeah, we'll set that, or if it's not work session, council meeting.
Sounds good. I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved, second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Can we take 5?
Yeah, let's take 5 and pick up at, what's the real time? 7:01? 7:06? Call.
Recording stopped.